Hello guys, do subscribe training programs, press the bell icon, never miss update.
And to open fire on these unarmed civilians. 1,650 bullets were fired, and Dyer proudly boasted not a single bullet was wasted. As the wailing, screaming crowd rushed to the exits, as Dyer proudly told the Inquiry Commission later, they made easier targets, that's why I put my soldiers at the gate. Every bullet struck somebody. The British acknowledged 379 dead. The Indians claim the figure was over 1,000, but certainly the bullet marks still stand. It was a horrendous massacre. But worse was to follow. Not only were these people killed and others deeply wounded and maimed, but Dyer barricaded the gates and left the dead, the dying, and the wounded to rot for 24 hours in the hot April sun. Those still alive were wailing piteously for water, and their families standing at the gate couldn't go in and help them. Dyer ordered Indians to crawl on their bellies on a side lane, and if they so much as lifted their heads were bashed in by British staves. After all this, as you can imagine, there was an uproar, there was a commission of inquiry, the House of Commons censured him. The House of Lords, however, not only exonerated him, but praised him. That flatulent voice of Victorian imperialism, Rudyard Kipling, called him the man who saved India. A collection was raised for him amongst the British in India and in London, and the princely sum in today's money of £250,000 was given to him together with a bejeweled sword. This entire package of events, the ingratitude for the support in the war, the betrayal of promises, the cruelty of the massacre, the indifference to Indian suffering afterwards, the racism that accompanied it, and then the self-justification and exoneration of the man, all of this put together makes Jallianwala Bagh the single worst atrocity of the British Raj in India. Now, can you imagine if on the centenary of that event, a member of the British royal family, because everything after all was done in the name of the crown, and no politician from Britain is likely to do this, but if a member of the British royal family were to come to Amritsar and ideally, like Willy Brandt, sink to their knees and beg forgiveness or express remorse and seek or even apologize for the horrendous wrong that was done in that incident 100 years earlier on that spot, and by extension for all the wrongs of 200 years of British rule, think what an extraordinary message that would send and what a cleansing effect it would have on the indelible stain of 200 years of British colonialism in India. I rest my case. Thank you very much. I'll take your questions.
And what we'd like to do is take your questions one by one. And as you ask your questions, please keep your questions as questions. Identify yourself and your affiliation. Thank you very much. How about this person?
There's a mic coming to you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Tharoor. My name is Osama Qamar, and I'm from Pakistan. You've argued time and again that Britain has a moral debt to pay reparations to India. But year 1948, RBI owed 75 crore rupees to Pakistan, which Gandhi, whose birthday is today, went on a hunger strike for, and only the first installment of that has been paid by India till date. Don't you think that India is actually following the footsteps of its colonizers right now?
Well, in fact, as you know, Gandhiji thought that the entire amount ought to be paid, and that was the theme of his last hunger strike. But as you probably also know, Nehru and Patel did agree and did pay the amount. So I'm a little curious as to where you get the impression that the full amount is not paid, but no doubt we'll both have to check our sources. To the best of my knowledge, it was all paid in 1948. Yeah. 55 crores was the exact amount. Yeah.
Hello, my name is Sonali Misra. I'm from Delhi, India. And I have this question. What is your view regarding the post-colonial mindset with regards to the English language? To give a bit of context, I studied English literature at the top arts college of India, Lady Shri Ram. And I'm over here studying creative writing in English because my ultimate aim is to be a published author in the English language, which sadly I'm now most comfortable with as opposed to Hindi, which is my mother tongue. So what is your view regarding it?
Well, it's a very interesting question because, of course, we're both in the same boat, and I've just addressed you in English. So I'm not quite sure that any of us can get off the hook. To begin with, the British had no intention of teaching English to the entire Indian masses. That was simply not their plan. In fact, they had no intention of spending that kind of money to begin with on Indian education. Will Durant, the American historian visiting India as late as 1930, was appalled to discover that the entire expenditure of the British government in India on education, from the lowest levels to the highest university, amounted to less than half the high school budget of the state of New York. So it really, which had 1/10 the population. So very clearly, the British were not interested in massive education. But what they did want was two things. They wanted to create a small class of Indians who would serve as interpreters between them and the masses they ruled. Lord Macaulay, in his famous minute, or his notorious minute on education in 1835, famously said that we need to create a class of people, Indians in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect, quote unquote. Now, this objective was to be met by educating just enough Indians to serve British purposes and giving them just enough education so they wouldn't create any trouble for the British. Now, the fact is that, as it turns out, the Indians decided to take this language that the English had brought and to use it for subversive purposes. They learned English to explore new ideas, ideas that went perhaps beyond the ones the British would have intended them to acquire, and to use them for purposes beyond that of facilitating British rule in India, but rather to actually explore ideas of their own freedom and autonomy that led eventually to calls for home rule and then for independence. It's striking, for example, that English became the principal language of Indian nationalism. Nehru wrote The Discovery of India in English. Jinnah made all his speeches in English. He's the language in which he was most comfortable. So it is a paradox that this happened. But the second thing the British tried to achieve with the introduction of English was what one might call the colonization of the mind. And that is, for example, the subject that you seem to have studied, English literature, was not taught anywhere in the world. It was invented to be taught to Indians. Professor Gauri Vishwanathan at Columbia University has an entire thesis about how the study of English literature as an academic discipline was created as an instrument of colonial subjugation. But not just subjugation, of overawing the subject, to make people feel that this is this great land that produced a great... Macaulay had notoriously said that the entire learning in every single books of India and Arabia are not worth a single shelf of British books. That's essentially the approach they had. And so that is something we have still not overcome. Those of us who went to school in India in the English language learned our Shakespeare, but didn't read Kalidasa. We may have, depending on the schools we went to, become familiar with the tales of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but not of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. You have to find those out at home. So you really have a situation in which that aspect of colonization of the mind, I'm afraid, has continued. And it's going to be something that each of us will have to overcome in our own ways. Not in any way to reject the extraordinary opportunities for learning and discovery that the English language has given us over the decades. And indeed, in today's world, in the globalized world of today, English is is a language of opportunity, of advancement, of employment, and so on. So I'm not at all anxious to move away from English. But for us to be able to use the language as, say, a Nehru or a Jinnah or a Dadabhai Naoroji or others did, without letting our minds be colonized by it. To see the language as something, as a tool and instrument for our thoughts, for our ideas, a vehicle to the destination we want to go, and not where those who invented the language wish to take us.
Good afternoon, Dr. Tharoor. My name's Abhishek Rakeja, and I'm from Bhopal in India, and I'm finally a politics student. I just wanted to take your views on some of the social depredations that the British subjected to us, especially the fact that, there was a very great limitation on free press and, ironically, on democracy, which the Allies were fighting in both the world wars. But what I particularly want to get your views on is the fact that similar depredations, especially socially, occur in India right now. I write editorials for this newspaper, and I've received several death threats over things that I've written, and we obviously saw the cold-blooded murder, if I put it like this, of Gauri Lankesh not too long ago. So aren't there shades of this, of what the British did in the tyranny of the government of India at the moment and the way that they've handled this entire situation?
I'm not sure I caught every word. The acoustics aren't terribly brilliant. But you wanted me to speak about particularly freedom of the press. Is that the point? Have I missed the example?
Yes. So the freedom of the press and the sort of social depredations that the
Did you say
government,
social applications?
the social deprivation of Indians that the government of India has been subjecting, especially if I was taking examples, the lynching of Indians.
You're referring to today's India and the events that are going
Yes,
on.
yes.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, as you know, I'm a member of the opposition, and I've spoken out very loudly and very vociferously against much of this. There's no question in my mind that they just turned up the volume on your mic as well. Thank you, whoever did that. Sound booth. No, the fact is that we are witnessing some very dangerous tendencies in India. None of which can be directly attributed to the government, other than the fact that the government has created the opportunity for unleashing a number of very, very unhealthy forces in our society, which it either appears to condone or not sufficiently to curb. So obviously the government claims that it's, not behind the so-called cow vigilantism that we have seen in the last couple of years. And they claim that anybody who conducts a mob lynching will be subject to the rule of law. But in practice, practically no one has been convicted for any of these heinous crimes and murders. And to my mind, the frustration we have today is the change in attitude as to what... I'll give you two examples. There's a horrendous story of Muhammad Akhlaq, father of a serving Indian Air Force soldier, who is attacked by a mob outside his house on the grounds that the bag of meat he's carrying is actually beef. The man is beaten to death. The mob bursts into his house, breaks open his door, destroys the door of his fridge and takes out the meat in it and rushes to the police station with it. And instead of being arrested for murder, they're let go while the police send the meat off to the lab to see if it was beef. I mean, is this the country that India is supposed to be about? As it turned out, it wasn't beef, but even if it was, is that grounds to allow a mob to murder an innocent human being? I mean, this is the sort of thing that the atmosphere that has been, that in so many ways has been allowed to prevail in parts of the country under the rule of our present government is something that is completely, I'll use the word foreign to the essence of India. This is not the way we've lived for millennia. I mean, and the last thing I want to see happening to my country is for it to turn into a Hindu Pakistan, with all reference to the Pakistanis here, who have their own battles to fight at home. So the short answer is, if that was your question, then of course I sympathize with you. Gauri Lankesh, one of the last things she did before she was shot was to retweet a tweet of mine in which I had shown a group of Kerala nuns performing an Onam Tiruvonam dance and talked about this is what Kerala's pluralism and secularism is all about. And she had talked about that in her Facebook post, and a couple of hours later she was shot. I mean, I feel her loss very keenly despite never having known her as a person. This is, to my mind, a very, very, very dangerous indication of the kinds of forces that have been unleashed by our government's refusal to take stern action against them.
Thank you very much. I'm Nandini. I'm from Calcutta, but I have adopted Edinburgh as my second city.
If you can...
Thank
Go on,
you.
sorry.
And I'm
I
a
was
member
going to
of...
say, if you can bear to be away from Calcutta. I remember the poet Pratish Nandi's famous line, "If you must exile me, Calcutta, blind my eyes before I go." I don't want that to happen to you, but I was just...
Yes, it has happened. But my humble question is, when Jallianwala Bagh incident was happening, Gandhi was there very much. And Congress was a powerful force in India.
No,
So,
it was a nationalist movement. It wasn't in power.
no, powerful force. I didn't say they were in power. Of course not. I only said they were a powerful force. So my humble question is, when these kind of incidents, you only mentioned about one, but when these kind of incidents were happening, what was and what were the stand of Congress as a forceful power or powerful force in India? And just today I was writing a post on Gandhi, whom I love very, very much, who grew and who developed himself, and he changed his policies throughout his career. But at that time, when Jallianwala Bagh was happening, what was his stance, and what was Congress as a powerful
I get your
force?
question. It was Congress that actually
What
created
was their stance?
Yeah, but it was Congress that created the uproar that resulted eventually in Daya being cashiered from the army. Congress refused to accept the findings of the British. They sent their own commission of inquiry, including a young Jawaharlal Nehru, to Jallianwala Bagh. Nehru personally counted every single bullet hole on the wall. They challenged the official account. They demanded action against Daya. It was a Congress that stirred up a huge nationalist frenzy around the country on this incident, and it had a profound effect on a lot of people. In many ways, it made Gandhi abandon the path of cooperation with the British. He would never again call on Indians to support the British war effort. In the First World War and in the Boer War before that, he had asked to support the British. In the Second World War, he called the British to quit India, leave India to God or to anarchy, as he said. So it had a transformative effect. Sir Rabindranath Tagore returned his knighthood. This was a huge event, no question, for Indians at that time, and the Congress was very much in the forefront of it.
Thank you.
One last question over there with the white shirt.
JP, I think you've been biased against that side of the room. Give some. There are lots of hands on that side. Back of those. Go ahead.
Thank you for the speech. My name is Manish. I used to study economics at the university. I graduated last year. So my question is, and I'll quote one of your writings from the great Indian novel, India is a highly developed civilization which is in an advanced state of decay. Might have missed a few words there, but do you think, and I get where this, or at least part of the decay comes from after your speech today. I think it shed some light on that decay. Do you think we're doing enough today to undo the decay?
Well, firstly, that line is the privilege of the satirist. It's from the opening paragraph of a satirical novel, so you do realize that one is allowed to poke fun in that process. I mean, one could argue that we already are doing a great deal. The book was published in 1989. 91, our liberalization started. We took steps to actually overcome the decay. And I think, literally in everything from the gleaming new airports to some of the gleaming new policies that have been instituted in the last 25 years or so, arguably that sentence could not be written with the same sort of impact today as it would have had at that time when it was manifestly, visibly true everywhere around. But for you to say, I get where this is coming from, my speech was not so much about that. My speech was essentially, we are very much a forgive and forget culture, aren't we? And I'm saying to the Indians, forgive. By all means, forgive. You must forgive, because not forgiving is bad for you. Nurturing hatred and bitterness actually hurts the hater far more than the hated. But I'm saying forgive, but don't forget. I just want people to remember. You can remember the past embrace the past, but leave it in the past. I am not asking for this to come in, for example, and affect our relationship with Britain today. I think that today's Britain and India are two sovereign equal nations. We don't need to have a chip on the shoulder about each other. We have a mutual language we can talk to, and on top of that, talk to each other in. Our economies are roughly the same size. So this is not about today's India-British relations. I think we can leave that behind where it was, but we need to know. Just as every individual would like to know a little bit about their parents and where they came from, maybe their grandparents, a society should know about its past. It's part of who we are today, what we were before. And that's the reason. So it's, the satire apart, this speech and this book is not about that idea. It's merely about let's forgive, but let's not forget.